The day Susanna Thatcher rode into Caldwell, Kansas, she had $3 in her pocket, a pistol she barely knew how to fire tucked into the waistband of her skirt, and a pair of men trailing her dust by less than a mile. The year was 1878, and Caldwell sat at the edge of everything, a cattle town perched on the border between Kansas and Indian Territory, loud and lawless enough that respectable folks from the East wrote letters home about it like it was the mouth of hell itself. But to Susanna, it was simply the nearest town with a livery stable and a sheriff's office, and those two things were all she needed right then. She pulled her bay mare to a stop in front of the livery, slid down from the saddle with legs that trembled from 2 days of hard riding, and handed the reins to a boy who could not have been older than 12. Her dark hair was loose from its pins, streaked with trail dust, and her blue dress, once fine, now ruined, was torn at the hem from where she had pushed through a thicket of brush to lose her pursuers for a few hours the night before. "Water her well," she told the boy, pressing one of her precious dollars into his palm. "She deserves it more than I do." The boy stared at her with wide eyes, clearly trying to decide whether to ask questions or simply take the money. He took the money. Susanna turned and looked down the main street of Caldwell. It was midday, the sun hammering the hard-packed dirt into something resembling iron. Saloon doors swung open and shut. A group of cowboys fresh off a cattle drive hooted at something from a second-floor porch. A woman in a red dress leaned against a post outside what was clearly a brothel and studied Susanna with frank, professional curiosity. At the far end of the street, past the general store and a barber shop with a faded pole, stood a solid-looking building with a sign above the door, "Sheriff, County of Sumner." Susanna walked toward it with as much dignity as she could manage. She pushed through the door without knocking. The interior was dim and smelled of coffee, gun oil, and old wood. There was a desk, a rack of rifles, a pot-bellied stove, and 2 cells made of iron bars along the back wall. And behind the desk, feet up, hat tilted over his face, sat a man who appeared to be sleeping. "Sheriff," she said. He did not move. "Sheriff," she said again, louder. The hat tilted up. A pair of dark brown eyes blinked at her from beneath the brim, taking stock of her in the unhurried way of a man who had learned long ago that most trouble announced itself before it arrived. He was perhaps 30, maybe a year or two past it, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same limestone that built the Kansas plains, a day's worth of dark stubble, and a badge that caught the light when he finally sat up and dropped his boots to the floor. "Help you?" he said. His voice was low and steady, the kind of voice that did not need to get louder to make itself felt. "My name is Susanna Thatcher," she said, "and I need your help, Sheriff. I need it urgently." He studied her for a moment, the torn dress, the loose hair, the dust on her cheeks that she now realized had a track through it where she had been crying at some point and not noticed. He stood up from his chair. He was tall, a good 6 feet, with broad shoulders that filled his shirt in the way of a man who worked with his body rather than merely sat behind a desk. "Tobias Hayes," he said. "Sit down, Miss Thatcher. Tell me what's happened." She sat, and she told him. It came out in pieces, the way truth often does when someone has been holding it together for too long. Her husband, late husband, she corrected herself, because Edgar Thatcher had died 4 months ago from a fever that took him in 2 days flat, had been a land agent in Dodge City. He had kept ledgers, detailed ones. Names, dates, payments, land claims that had been filed under false pretenses and then sold to settlers who did not know the deeds were worthless. Edgar had not been innocent, Susanna said quietly, looking at her hands, but he had kept the ledgers because he had been told to, and there were names in those ledgers that certain men very much did not want written down anywhere. Those men had come to her house 6 days ago. They wanted the ledgers. She had not had them. She had not even known they existed until 2 weeks before that, when she found them hidden behind a false panel in Edgar's office while she was settling his estate. She had taken them to a lawyer in Dodge City, a man named Fielding, and Fielding had told her the ledgers were worth lives. Then Fielding had disappeared. So she had run. She had the ledgers with her wrapped in oilskin inside her saddlebag, which was now in the livery with her mare. And behind her, approximately 1 mile back, she was fairly certain were two men named Cleet Ryerson and Dutch Morrow, who worked for a man named Harlan Greer, who owned half of the property that had been fraudulently transferred and stood to lose everything if those ledgers reached a federal marshal. Tobias Hayes listened to all of this without interrupting. When she finished, he walked to the window and looked out at the street. Then he walked to the door and looked out at that too. "Cleet Ryerson," he said. "You know him." "I know of him." He turned back to face her. "He has killed 2 men that I know of and 1 that I suspect. He is not someone who changes his mind once he has been sent to do a thing." Susanna felt the cold that had been living in her chest for 6 days settle a little deeper. "Then you understand why I need help." "I understand," he said. He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him thinking, not panicking, not dramatizing, simply working through something the way a man works through a problem that has a practical solution if you look at it right. "Here is what I am going to do, Miss Thatcher. I am going to put you in one of those cells." She stared at him. "Not as a prisoner," he said, and for the first time something in his expression shifted, not quite a smile, but the suggestion of one. "As the safest place in Caldwell. Those bars are iron. The walls are stone on the outside. If Ryerson and Morrow come here looking for you, they will not find a woman hiding in a boarding house or a hotel room. They will find the inside of a sheriff's office, which is the last place men like that want to be caught committing violence." "You want to lock me in a cell," she said slowly. "I want to keep you alive," he said. "The cell is how I do that tonight. Tomorrow morning I can get a wire to the federal marshal's office in Wichita, but tonight this is the safest place for you." Susanna looked at the iron bars. She looked at Tobias Hayes. She had not trusted many people in the last 6 days, and the ones she had trusted had either disappeared or sent her running harder. But there was something in this man, in the plain, undecorated directness of him, in the way he had listened without disbelief or condescension, that made the tight knot in her chest loosen just barely. "All right," she said, "but I want my saddlebag from the livery. The ledgers stay with me." "I'll get it myself," he said. "You stay here and do not open that door for anyone." He went. He came back in under 10 minutes with her saddlebag, and with a woman in tow, a stout, gray-haired woman named Mrs. Calloway, who ran the boarding house 2 streets over and who, Susanna would later learn, had been feeding Tobias Hayes his Sunday dinners for 3 years because she said he forgot to eat otherwise. Mrs. Calloway took one look at Susanna, said "Lord above, child," and produced from somewhere in her apron a piece of cold cornbread and a flask of water, both of which Susanna accepted with a gratitude that was almost embarrassing in its desperation. Tobias unlocked the cell, held the door open with a courtesy that struck Susanna as almost absurd given the circumstances, and she walked in. He locked it behind her. He hung the key on a hook behind his desk that was in her line of sight, which she understood was deliberate. He was showing her she was not truly imprisoned. "Try to sleep," he said. "I'll be here." Mrs. Calloway left. The afternoon light stretched long and orange across the floor. Outside, Caldwell continued its noisy business, horses and boots and voices, and the thin sound of a piano being played badly somewhere down the street. Susanna sat on the cot, which was thin but not unkind, with the saddlebag in her lap, and tried to remember the last time she had felt safe enough to sleep. She could not. Tobias Hayes sat at his desk. He did not seem to sleep either. He cleaned his pistol with the methodical care of a man who treated his tools like promises. Then he poured himself coffee from the pot on the stove and sat back in his chair. "You said your husband kept those ledgers because he was told to," Tobias said, not looking at her but clearly speaking to her. "Who told him?" "Harlan Greer," she said. "Edgar worked for Greer's Land Company for 6 years. Greer was a well-regarded man in Dodge City. He has a house. He hosts dinners. He shakes hands with the right people." She paused. "He is also a fraud and a thief, and several families lost everything because of the land he sold them with false deeds." "You said families." His voice did not change, but something in it sharpened slightly. Yes, settlers. Some of them had saved for years. One family, the Webbers, I think their name was, came all the way from Ohio with 4 children. She stopped. The anger that had been living alongside the fear rose for a moment. They built a house on land they thought was theirs, and then one day men came and told them they had no legal claim and would have to leave. And there was nothing they could do because they had no money left for lawyers, and Greer had men who could make things difficult for anyone who pushed back. Tobias was quiet for a long moment. "That is a particular kind of evil," he said finally. "The kind that wears a collar and gets invited to dinner." "Yes," Susanna agreed softly. "Exactly that kind." She was not sure when she fell asleep, but at some point the long orange light became dark and the sounds of Caldwell settled into something slower and more muted, and the next thing she was fully aware of was a sound, voices outside, close, sharp. She was on her feet before she was fully awake. Through the front window she could see the street. 2 horses stood tied to the post in front of the sheriff's office. 2 men stood with them, and they were speaking to Tobias Hayes, who had stepped out onto the narrow porch. One of the men was heavyset with a red beard. The other was lean and still, in the way of men who are dangerous when they finally decide to move. She could not hear everything, but she heard her name. She pressed herself against the wall of the cell and gripped the iron bar. Tobias Hayes's voice carried more clearly than the other's, calm, inflexible, entirely without apology. "I have no record of any such woman passing through Caldwell. A lot of people come through here. I cannot keep track of everyone." The heavy-set man, Cleet Ryerson, she assumed, said something that made the lean man laugh. It was not a pleasant laugh. Tobias said something that she could not fully hear, but that ended with the word, "Move on." There was a pause that lasted long enough that Susanna's breathing stopped. Then the sound of boots on the porch steps and horses being untied and hooves on the hard dirt moving away. Not fast, not the retreat of men who had been scared off, but the casual withdrawal of men who were deciding to come back another way. Tobias came inside and closed the door. He stood for a moment with his back to her, his hand on the door. Then he turned. "They are gone for now," he said, "but they are not gone. They're going to a hotel or a saloon, and they're going to wait and watch." He crossed to the desk and sat down heavily, as if the conversation had cost something. "Ryerson tried to tell me you were a wanted woman, said there was paper on you out of Dodge City." "That is a lie," she said, and she heard the steel in her own voice. "I know it is," he said simply. "There is no paper on you. I know what papers come through this office." Something in Susanna shifted at that, at the plainness of his belief in her, offered without theater or qualification. She had spent 6 days being afraid, and in that time she had been doubted and looked at sideways and treated as a problem to be managed. This man's simple, matter-of-fact certainty that she was telling the truth was, she found, to her surprise, nearly enough to make her cry. She did not cry. She sat back down on the cot. "How long have you been sheriff here?" she asked. It was partly that she wanted to know and partly that she wanted to talk, because the night was long and the silence had sharp edges. 4 years, he said. He poured her a cup of coffee through the bars, which required some careful maneuvering but which he managed without spilling, and handed it to her. She took it gratefully. "Came here from Texas, originally. Worked cattle drives for a few years. Scouted for the Army for a while. Something I am not entirely proud of, in retrospect." He said that last part quietly, and there was something in it that told her the Army work had shown him things he wished he had not seen. "Why not proud?" He looked at her, considering. Then, "Because the Army was not always right about who it was fighting or why, and I was young enough to follow orders before I understood what I was following them into." He paused. "By the time I understood, I had done things I could not undo. So I came here and tried to do things that were worth doing." Susanna turned her coffee cup in her hands. Outside, the wind picked up, the kind of Kansas wind that had no patience for anything that wasn't bolted down. It rattled the window in its frame. "Edgar was not a good man," she said. not sure exactly why she was telling him this except that the truth had been building in her for 4 months and had nowhere to go. He was not cruel, not to me, not directly, but he was weak, I suppose, in the particular way that makes a person willing to do wrong because saying no to the right people seemed harder than saying yes. And I did not know. I truly did not know. We married 7 years ago and I thought, she stopped. I thought he was simply a land agent. I thought we had a quiet, ordinary life. And then he died, Tobias said, not harshly. And then he died and I found the ledgers and I realized that nothing had been what I thought it was. She looked at the iron bars in front of her. It is a particular kind of grief, she said, echoing his words back to him without quite meaning to lose someone and then discover you are not sure who you lost. He looked at her for a long moment. Yes, he said, I think that might be the hardest kind. The night moved on. The wind kept up its conversation with the window. At some point Tobias added wood to the stove, and the warmth of it spread through the small building in a way that felt almost gentle, almost kind. They talked. Not constantly. There were stretches of comfortable quiet, which surprised Susanna because she had not thought she was capable of feeling comfortable in a jail cell with a man she had met that afternoon. But the quiet with Tobias Hayes was not empty. It felt inhabited. She learned that he had a brother in Texas who ran cattle, that he could cook exactly 2 things well, coffee and biscuits, and that Mrs. Calloway supplemented everything else. That he had been engaged once, briefly, to a schoolteacher who had come west from Ohio and decided 2 months later that the West was not at all what she had imagined and had gone home. He said it without bitterness, which she found admirable. He learned that she had grown up in Missouri, that her father had been a schoolteacher, that she had a head for numbers and had in fact kept Edgar's household accounts with a precision that now, given what she knew about the rest of his financial dealings, struck her as deeply ironic. That she could ride better than she could shoot, that she had not slept more than 3 hours at a stretch since the men had come to her house in Dodge City. Sleep now, he said, somewhere past midnight. I will not sleep. I will be right here. She lay down on the thin cot with her saddlebag pulled close. The stove ticked. Outside, a horse moved somewhere in the dark. She listened for danger in every sound and found instead the steadying rhythm of Tobias Hayes's presence, the occasional scrape of his chair, the small sound of him refilling his coffee cup, and once, very quietly, what she thought might have been him humming something under his breath, just a few bars of a hymn she recognized from childhood. She slept. She woke to light the thin, honest gray of early morning pushing in under the door, and to Tobias Hayes's voice saying her name with a controlled urgency that brought her fully upright in a single motion. He was at the front window. Ryerson is across the street, he said. He has been there since first light. Morrow I have not located, which is worse. Susanna stood, straightened her dress, and finger-combed her hair with whatever dignity she could manage. The marshal, she said, the wire. I sent my deputy 20 minutes ago. Billy is 16 and fast, and Ryerson does not know his face. He glanced at her. How are you? Awake, she said, which is more than I expected. His mouth curved. It was not a large smile, but it transformed his face in a way that made her catch her breath, made him look younger, and she thought, like someone who had once laughed easily and was slowly remembering how. There is cornbread, he said, nodding toward the desk where a cloth-wrapped parcel sat. Mrs. Calloway came at first light. I told her not to, but she is the kind of woman who treats "I told you not to" as a starting point for negotiation. Susanna laughed. It surprised her, the laugh, the ease of it, the way it moved through her chest like something loosening. She pressed her hand to her mouth and then dropped it because there was nothing wrong with laughing. Tobias watched her laugh and looked, for just a moment, slightly undone by it. Then he turned back to the window with the careful neutrality of a man reminding himself of his professional responsibilities. The morning came apart slowly, and then all at once. Billy, the deputy, a gangly young man with ears that stood out from his head at an optimistic angle, came back without a response from Wichita because the wire was down. Not unusual in a Kansas wind, he said apologetically. He had left a message with the telegraph operator, who would send it the moment the line came back up. Could be hours. Could be the day. Cleet Ryerson came through the door of the sheriff's office at 9:30. He came in alone, which was not quite what Tobias had expected and therefore required rapid adjustment. Ryerson was a big man, not tall but wide in the way of a man who had done hard physical labor for most of his life and whose body had simply consolidated itself into something immovable. His red beard was untrimmed and his eyes were the flat, washed-out blue of a sky before a storm. He looked at Tobias. He looked at Susanna in the cell. He looked at Tobias again. "Morning, Sheriff," he said, pleasantly enough. "Morning," Tobias said. He was standing between the desk and the cell, casual but precisely placed, in the way Susanna had already begun to recognize as his habit, always knowing where things were, always knowing where he was in relation to them. "Funny thing," Ryerson said, looking at Susanna. "I was just telling my friend last night that I was sure I had seen this woman ride into town, and here she is. Small world." "Miss Thatcher is in my protective custody," Tobias said. "She came to me yesterday reporting a credible threat to her safety. I intend to hold her here until I can put her in contact with a federal marshal." Ryerson's pleasant expression did not change. "That right? See, the thing is, Sheriff, she is actually something of a, let us call it a troubled individual. Her husband recently passed, God rest him, and she has had some difficulty accepting that certain property of his employer was borrowed, not given. We are just here to help her understand that and to bring her home safely." Susanna gripped the cell bar and said, clearly and without raising her voice, "I am not going anywhere with you, Mr. Ryerson." Ryerson looked at her with something in his face that was far older and colder than the pleasantness he was wearing. "Miss Thatcher," he said, "I strongly encourage you to reconsider." "She has reconsidered," Tobias said. "The answer is still no. Now you have been heard. I suggest you leave this office before I decide there is enough cause to hold you here instead." Ryerson studied him for a long moment, the measuring look of a man estimating odds. Then he smiled, and the smile was more unsettling than anything else he had done. "We will be in town for a spell, Sheriff," he said. "I suspect the situation will resolve itself." He left. The door swung shut behind him. Tobias stood still for a moment and then turned to Susanna. "He is going to wait for an opportunity. He will not come at me directly, not yet, but he will look for a moment when I am not here or when you are moved." He sat down at the desk. "I need to think." "Think out loud," she said. "Two sets of eyes." He looked at her with something that was almost surprise and then nodded. "The wire needs to reach Wichita. A marshal would get here in 2 days if he rode hard, maybe 3. I need to keep you here and Ryerson out until then. The problem is Morrow. I do not know where Morrow is." "Tell me about Morrow," she said. "Lean man, very quiet, does not make speeches like Ryerson does, which means he is probably already doing something rather than standing across the street." He drummed his fingers on the desk. "Billy." The deputy appeared from the back, where he had been lurking with the anxious energy of someone who wanted to help and was unsure how. "Find Morrow," Tobias said. "Don't approach him. Don't let him see you watching. Just find him and come tell me where he is." Billy left. The morning stretched out in taut, watchful silence. Tobias cleaned the rifle on his desk. Susanna ate the cornbread. It was good. Mrs. Calloway apparently did not believe in mediocrity, and thought about the ledgers in her saddlebag and the families who had lost their land, and whether justice was something that still happened out here or whether it was mostly a word people used to mean the version of events that benefited them. "When this is over," she said, "assuming it goes right, what happens to the ledgers?" "They go to the federal marshal," Tobias said, "who presents them to the appropriate authority, which in a case involving fraudulent land claims would likely be the land office and possibly the federal circuit court in Wichita." He paused. "It will take time. These things always do, but the ledgers are evidence, and evidence is how you build a case that does not rely on one person's word. Edgar's name is in those ledgers," she said, "as a participant. I know. His estate, such as it is, could be implicated." "Yes." She looked at the saddlebag. She thought about Edgar, and the things she had not known, and whether she owed it to the truth or to his memory to protect what little remained of his name. She thought about the Weber family, 4 children, a house built on land that was never theirs. Good, she said. His name should be there, it's the truth. Tobias looked at her with an expression she could not quite name, something that lived between respect and something softer and more complicated than respect. Billy came back around noon, breathless and wide-eyed. Dutch Morrow, he reported, had been seen going into the telegraph office an hour ago. He had stayed for approximately 20 minutes. He had left without sending a wire. Billy had confirmed this with the operator, but he had asked questions about the status of the line. Tobias was on his feet before Billy finished speaking. He is trying to find out whether we have reached the marshal. Which means Greer knows you are going for the marshal, Susanna said. Which means they are going to move soon, before the marshal gets here. Their eyes met across the cell bars. She thought in that moment that she had never seen a person's face so readable and yet so contained. He was worried she could see it, and he was working hard to make sure the worry did not swallow the thinking. I have an idea, she said, but you are not going to like it. Tell me anyway. The Ledgers need to not be here. If Ryerson decides to take this office by force, he would have to deal with me, Tobias said flatly. Yes. And 2 against 1 are not good odds, and I will not be responsible for. She stopped herself. What if we send the Ledgers out of town, with someone they do not know, in a direction they would not expect? He thought about this. Mrs. Calloway's nephew runs freight, leaves for Wichita every Thursday. He checked the date mentally. That is tomorrow morning. Tomorrow morning may be too late. Yes, he agreed. It may be. They worked it out between them, she supplying the details, he supplying the knowledge of the town and its people. It was the first of many times Susanna would notice this about Tobias Hayes. He was not the kind of man who needed an idea to be his own. He was interested in the idea working, not in having originated it. Mrs. Calloway was summoned discreetly through Billy, who went out the back. She arrived within the hour, red-cheeked and brisk, was briefed on the situation with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a woman who had lived through enough frontier winters to find most other problems manageable, and agreed without hesitation to carry the oilskin package to her nephew's freight wagon that afternoon and ride with it partway toward Wichita before circling back. I am not afraid of those men, Mrs. Calloway said firmly. No, Tobias agreed, but they should be afraid of you. She left with the Ledgers tucked under her shawl. Susanna watched her go through the window and felt the absence of the saddlebag like a held breath. The Ledgers were the evidence. Without them, she was just a woman making accusations. But keeping them here was too dangerous, and Mrs. Calloway, solid and unremarkable, a boarding-house matron who had lived in Caldwell for 15 years, was less likely to attract Ryerson's attention than anyone else in town. The afternoon of that second day was the longest Susanna had ever spent. Tobias moved between the window and the door with a patience she found both reassuring and aching to witness, because she could see the toll the waiting took, the slight tension in his jaw, the way his hand occasionally went to his holster and then dropped away. He was not a man who enjoyed being stationary when he believed action might be needed. But action without information was just noise, and he knew it. Tell me something about yourself that has nothing to do with any of this, she said around 3 in the afternoon, because the silence had started to press again, and because she genuinely wanted to know. He stopped his circuit of the room and looked at her with something that was almost amusement. Such as what? Anything. What did you do the last Sunday you had that was entirely ordinary? He thought about this for longer than she expected. Then, I went fishing, he said. There is a creek about 2 miles north of town. I went in the morning and caught 2 good-sized catfish, which I gave to Billy because I do not enjoy cooking fish. And then I sat there for another 2 hours just sitting. Watching the water, he paused. I do not do that enough, just sit somewhere without needing it to mean anything. No, she said softly, I do not either. She told him about the garden she had kept in Dodge City, a small one, more ambitious than practical, in which she had grown tomatoes and morning glories and herbs she never quite had occasion to use. She told him about the morning glories in particular, how they opened each day like something newly decided, and how she had found that in the worst months after Edgar died, going out in the morning to see them was the thing that made her put her feet on the floor. He listened. He had the rare quality, she was realizing, of listening as though what you said mattered rather than as though he was simply waiting for his turn to speak. "My mother grew morning glories," he said, "in Texas. Along the back fence." He said it simply, the way you say a thing that belongs to a specific place in your chest. They were so deep in conversation that Billy had to say the sheriff's name twice to get his attention when he came back around 4 with news that the telegraph line had been repaired and a message had been successfully sent to Wichita. Tobias straightened immediately. Response: "Operator says Marshal Delaney was in Wichita as of yesterday and can ride out tonight if he pushes." "Tonight? That is 36 hours, maybe 40. "Yes, sir, 36 hours. Susanna worked the number through her mind. A night and a day and another night. The wire down twice already. Ryerson and Morrow knowing that time was running out. They will come tonight," she said, "or very early tomorrow. They will not wait for a marshal." Tobias nodded slowly. He looked at Billy. "Get Tom Wheeler. Tell him I need him armed and here by sundown." Tom Wheeler was a deputy who worked the night beat, an older man, quieter than Billy, with 20 years on the frontier and hands that did not shake. "Yes, sir," Billy said and went. Tobias turned to Susanna. He stood a few feet from the bars, close enough that she could see the details of him clearly, the small scar above his right eyebrow, the way his collar sat slightly askew, the lines around his eyes that came from squinting into Kansas sun and not, she thought, from laughing. "Miss Thatcher," he said, "I am going to keep you safe. I want you to know that is not just professional obligation talking." She held his gaze. "Susanna," she said, "I think we have reached first-name territory." Something in his face opened just slightly. "Susanna," he said, as though trying out the shape of it, "all right. And I believe you," she said. "That is not nothing. I have not believed anyone much lately." They stood there for a moment, the bars between them, the late light doing its long golden work on the dust in the air, and Susanna was aware with peculiar clarity of the unreasonable fact that she was in a jail cell in Kansas, and had not felt this understood by another person in perhaps her entire adult life. "How is it," she said quietly, "that a person can be married for 7 years and lonelier than she has ever been in the first 48 hours of being locked up by a stranger?" She had not quite meant to say that, but there it was. Tobias was quiet for a moment. "I think," he said carefully, "that loneliness is not about being alone. It is about whether the person you are with actually sees you." She looked at him. He looked back at her with the same directness he brought to everything, and she understood that he was not making a speech. He was just saying what he believed to be true. "Yes," she said, "that is exactly it." The evening came. Tom Wheeler arrived, a thick-set, deliberate man who nodded at Susanna with courtesy and took up a position by the back window with the air of a man who had done this kind of waiting before and found it neither exciting nor unpleasant. Billy took the front. Tobias sat outside the cell. He had pulled his chair closer to the bars than he had kept it all day, close enough that they could speak quietly. The stove was going. The lamps were lit low. Outside, Caldwell kept its nighttime rhythms, piano, laughter, an argument somewhere that resolved itself without gunfire. "Tell me about the marshal's service," Susanna said. "What happens when Delaney gets here? He will want to hear everything from you directly. He will look at the ledgers. Mrs. Calloway will bring them back when I send for her tomorrow morning. He will file them as evidence." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "The case against Greer will take time, months probably. There will need to be a grand jury. Witnesses, it will not be simple. And Ryerson and Morrow, I intend to arrest them," he said with a simplicity that made it sound as uncomplicated as buying sugar at the general store. "Tonight if they give me cause, and if they give you more than cause." He met her eyes. "That is what the badge is for," he said, And Tom and Billy, though I try to keep Billy away from genuine trouble because he has a mother in Ohio who writes him letters." Susanna smiled at that. "You care about him." "He is a good kid," Tobias said, with a gruff affection that he seemed slightly embarrassed by. "He will be an excellent lawman in about 5 years when he grows into himself." They talked about Kansas, about what it had been before the cattle drives and the settlers, the great grasslands running to every horizon, the way the sky opened up out here in a way it did not in places with mountains or trees to interrupt it. He had a plainsman's affinity for open space that she recognized, having lived in the Midwest long enough to feel cramped whenever she went east. She told him about the first time she had seen the plains riding west with Edgar in a wagon, 7 years ago, leaving Missouri behind. How the land had opened up gradually and then all at once, and how she had stood up in the wagon and spread her arms because she could not help it, because the sky was too large to experience sitting down. He laughed at that, a real laugh, not a polite one, and she stored it away like something valuable, the sound of Tobias Hayes laughing. It was past 2 in the morning when the sound came. Not a loud sound. That was the thing. Not a crash or a shout or the report of a firearm. Just a small, careful sound from the back of the building. A window, or what might have been a window. Tom Wheeler moved before anyone spoke. He went low along the back wall, his rifle up, his 60-year-old body abandoning whatever stiffness it had accumulated in the past hours with the fluid memory of long-established training. Tobias was on his feet. Susanna, down. He was already moving toward the back, putting himself between her and wherever the sound had come from. She crouched low on the cot, making herself small, her heart going loud and fast in her chest. There was a moment of suspended silence so complete she could hear the wind outside. Then Tom Wheeler said in a voice of remarkable calm, "Don't." A pause. Then the sound of someone backing away. Footsteps quick and retreating outside the back wall. Tom came back into the main room. "Morrow," he said, "was working at the back window with something, did not expect to find anyone watching." He said it the way a man reports a minor irregularity in a well-functioning system. "He will report back to Ryerson," Tobias said. "He was at the front window looking out at the street." "And Ryerson?" Susanna asked from her crouch. "Still across the street. He has been there all evening." Tobias's voice was steady. "He was watching the front. Morrow was the attempt. Now he knows we are not sleeping." The night after that was quieter. Morrow did not come back, and Ryerson, visible through the window in the pooled light of a street lamp, eventually moved on around 3 in the morning. Whether he went to his hotel or somewhere else, they could not say. Susanna did not sleep again. She sat up against the cell wall, and Tobias moved his chair back to the position it had been in before the interruption, outside the bars, close. They did not talk much in those last dark hours before dawn. They sat in the kind of silence that has stopped being uncomfortable and has become something else entirely. The silence of two people who have gotten through a difficult night together and feel the particular closeness that comes from that. Once, in the half hour before the light changed, Tobias reached through the bars and touched her hand. It was brief, just a moment, his fingers over hers, a contact that said something neither of them had said in words. She did not pull away. She turned her hand over slightly, just enough to let him know she had felt it and what she thought of it. He withdrew his hand, but the warmth of it stayed. Dawn came. Billy, who had fallen asleep in his chair around 4 and been allowed to by Tobias and Tom, who had exchanged the look of men who understood the mercy of letting youth sleep, while age keeps watch, woke with a start and was immediately mortified. Tobias told him to ride to Mrs. Calloway's and bring the ledgers back, and the relief of having a task restored Billy's composure considerably. Tom Wheeler went home to sleep, having been on his feet for 12 hours, and left with the sturdy certainty of a man who would be back when needed, no questions required. Ryerson appeared at 9 in the morning. Not at the sheriff's office this time, at the end of the street on horseback, with Morrow beside him. They sat their horses and looked at the office and then rode slowly out of town, north. Billy came back with the ledgers at 9:30. The oilskin package sat on Tobias's desk like a small, explosive fact. They ate the breakfast Mrs. Calloway had sent: biscuits, salt pork, dried apple, and did not speak much, both of them running on too little sleep and too much sustained alertness, which produces a specific kind of exhaustion that food only partially addresses. "They've gone," Tobias said, looking out the window with the careful skepticism of a man who had learned that apparent good news was frequently a delayed form of bad news. "Riding north." "Or riding north until they are out of sight," Susanna said. "Yes." "Could they have gotten word to Greer? Could Greer send more men?" "In theory, yes. But a telegraph message takes minutes and men take days, and Delaney should be here before anyone new arrives." He paused. "I think they may have decided the marshal coming makes this too hot. That their best strategy is to disappear and let Greer deny all knowledge." "Which would let Greer himself escape justice," she said, and the anger moved through her again. "The ledgers will do what the men cannot," he said. "Greer's name is in them, you said. The transactions, the payments. That is the evidence that puts him in front of a judge, not Ryerson." She knew he was right. She just wanted to believe that the men who had chased her across Kansas would face some consequence for it. She said as much. "They will," Tobias said, with the quiet certainty of a man who had spent 4 years enforcing a law that was imperfect but not nothing. "If not today, then eventually. Men like Ryerson do not change their trade. They will end up in front of a judge sooner or later." Marshal Delaney arrived the following afternoon, having ridden through the night with one brief rest, a short, weathered man with iron-gray hair, and the manner of someone who had seen enough of human nature to find most of it neither surprising nor particularly dismaying. He shook Tobias's hand, unlocked Susanna's cell himself with a respect that acknowledged what it meant to have spent 2 nights in one for reasons other than wrongdoing, and sat at Tobias's desk with the ledgers and a notebook for 2 hours while Susanna told him everything. He asked good questions. He wrote in a small, precise hand. He thanked her in the dry, professional way of a man for whom thank you was not a social nicety but an acknowledgment of something earned. "Your husband's name will appear in the record," he said. "I know," she said. "It should be there." Delaney glanced at Tobias, then back at her with something that might have been approval. "There will be a proceeding in Wichita. We will need your testimony. It may be some months before it comes to court." "I understand. Where are you living, ma'am?" She opened her mouth to say Dodge City, and then stopped. Because Dodge City was where Edgar's house was, her house now legally, though she had not thought of it as hers, and it was where Harlan Greer held his dinners and shook his hands, and where she would be known as the widow Thatcher who had caused trouble. She thought about going back there and felt nothing but weariness. "I am not certain yet," she said. Delaney nodded, wrote something in his notebook, and went on to other things. When he was done and had secured the ledgers in his saddlebag to carry personally to Wichita, Susanna stood outside the sheriff's office for the first time in 2 days in the full afternoon sun, breathing the dusty Kansas air with something that was not quite relief and not quite joy but was a cousin to both. Tobias stood beside her. "Where will you go?" he asked. She had been thinking about this since the morning. "I have not decided," she said honestly. "I have no strong reason to return to Dodge City. I have no family anywhere particular." She looked at the street at Caldwell going about its business, a little loud, a little rough, entirely unremarkable in its particular frontier way. "This is as good a town as any while I figure it out." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Mrs. Calloway rents rooms," he said, in the careful, neutral tone of a man who is trying to make a practical suggestion and is very aware that he is not entirely motivated by practicality. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the street. "Mrs. Calloway's," she said. "Yes, that sounds reasonable." He glanced at her, and the glance was brief and telling, the particular look of a man who is very pleased about something, and is doing his level best not to show it in a way that would be inappropriate given the circumstances. "They went to see Mrs. Calloway, who took one look at the two of them standing on her porch and smiled the knowing smile of a woman who has seen enough of the world to recognize things before they are fully formed. She gave Susanna the best room. It had a window that looked east, which meant it caught the morning light. Susanna stood at it that first evening and thought about morning glories. The weeks that followed were, in some ways, the most interesting of Susanna's life, which was saying something given the 2 days she had spent in a jail cell. Caldwell was exactly the kind of town she had expected, half-lawless, vivid, full of people in transit who were either coming from somewhere terrible or going toward something hopeful, and often both. She found work quickly, because a woman who could keep accounts and had no patience for imprecision was useful in a frontier town where most bookkeeping was aspirational at best. She kept the books for the general store, for the livery, and eventually for 2 other businesses whose owners had been keeping their own accounts, with a confidence that the accounts did not entirely support. She was paid fairly, which she had half expected not to be, and which she attributed in some part to the fact that the sheriff's office was at the end of the street, and Tobias Hayes was known to take a dim view of dishonest dealing. She saw Tobias Hayes every day. This was partly geographic coincidence. The town was not large, and partly because Mrs. Calloway's Sunday dinners had expanded to include Susanna as a matter of course, and Tobias Hayes had been attending those dinners for 3 years and showed no signs of stopping, and partly because they had both, without explicitly deciding to, fallen into a habit of conversation that neither of them seemed to want to give up. He came by the general store most mornings on his way down the street, ostensibly to check in with the proprietor, Mr. Alderman, about anything that might require his attention. Susanna worked at a desk behind the counter, and she was aware every morning of the precise moment he came through the door, not because she was watching for it, but because her body apparently registered it separately from her attention, like a change in weather. He would tip his hat to Mr. Alderman, exchange a few words, and then stop at her desk, and they would talk for 10 or 15 minutes about anything. The weather, the news from Wichita that came with the stage, a book she had found in Mrs. Calloway's sitting room, something that had happened in town. Small things that added up to something large. She noticed the things about him that you only notice when you see a person regularly. That he took his coffee with no sugar, that he had a habit of straightening things that were slightly askew, that he was quietly but genuinely kind to Billy in a way that required no audience, that he occasionally looked at her with an expression that lasted a fraction of a second too long before he looked away. She did not know what to do with the feeling that had been building in her since that first night in the cell. She had been married, and unhappily enough in retrospect, that she was wary of the thing she was feeling, wary not because it felt wrong but because it felt better than she thought she deserved, or better than she was prepared to trust. One afternoon in October, 3 weeks after she had arrived, she was coming back from the telegraph office. She had sent a message to the federal court in Wichita confirming her address and her willingness to testify, and she passed a group of men outside the saloon who made a remark as she walked by that was intended to be heard. She stopped walking. She turned around. She faced the man who had spoken, a cattleman, recently arrived, who was drunk in the late afternoon way of someone who had started at noon. "Say that again," she said clearly. He looked surprised that she had stopped. He said something that was half retreat and half bluster. "I thought not," she said, and walked on. She was still annoyed when she reached the sheriff's office, where she went because it was the most direct route back to Mrs. Calloway's and because she was honest with herself, because she wanted to tell someone and Tobias Hayes was the person she wanted to tell things to. He was there. She told him. He listened, and his jaw tightened in the way it did when he heard about something he thought was wrong but which he recognized was not technically his jurisdiction. "I handled it," she said. "I can see that," he said. "I do not need you to go speak to him." "I know you do not." He looked at her for a moment. "It still makes me angry." She looked back at him and thought about how strange it was, To have someone be angry on her behalf without her having to ask for it, not angry in a possessive way, not angry because she was his, but angry because it was wrong and she was a person who deserved to be treated as one. "Thank you," she said, and meant it precisely for what it was. Something shifted in his expression. He stood up from his desk and came around it slowly with the deliberateness of a man who has decided something and is committed to seeing it through without theatrical incident. "Susanna," he said. She waited. "I would like to take you to dinner," he said. "Not at Mrs. Calloway's, at the restaurant on 2nd Street, on a Friday when they have the good beef." He paused. "Not as anything but what it is, which is that I would like to have dinner with you in a situation where I am not either expecting gunfire or sitting outside a jail cell. Though I was not unhappy about the jail cell situation, looking back." She had been waiting for this, she realized, had been turning it over in her head, anticipating it and being afraid of it and wanting it simultaneously. And now that it was here, stated plainly by a plain-spoken man in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, she found the fear did not have much room to stand up in the presence of the wanting. "Friday," she said. Yes, Friday was fine. Saturday was also fine, because they did not go home until quite late, and so there was a Saturday morning in the general store where she was smiling at nothing in particular, and Mr. Alderman very carefully did not comment on it. What followed was the peculiar and wonderful thing of falling in love in a town that was watching, which in a place like Caldwell meant it was noticed and discussed with varying levels of accuracy, but with universal interest. Mrs. Calloway did not say, "I knew it," with words, but her increased attention to the dessert portions on Sunday evenings conveyed the sentiment sufficiently. They had 2 months of Fridays and Saturdays and morning conversations in the general store, and evenings on Mrs. Calloway's porch when the weather permitted, and then when it did not, evenings in the parlor with the lamp and whatever book was making the rounds of Caldwell's small reading community. In that time Susanna learned who Tobias Hayes was in all the ways you only learn through consistent proximity. His impatience with cruelty and his patience with almost everything else, his dry and understated humor, his stubbornness on certain points of principle that she sometimes agreed with and sometimes argued with vigorously, the way he looked in the early evening when he had been working and was tired but still lit up when she came in. The testimony in Wichita came in November, on a cold day when the plains were already browning at the edges, and the sky had that particular steel-blue quality that announces winter with certainty. Tobias rode with her, which she had not asked him to do, and which he had offered simply as a fact, not a question. They took the stage to Wichita, which was 2 days' travel, and sat beside each other for 2 days with their shoulders occasionally touching in a way that was neither accidental nor discussed. The federal court was a sober room with tall windows. The judge was a thin man with spectacles who wrote in a precise, small script that reminded Susanna of Marshall Delaney. She gave her testimony for 3 hours. The ledgers were presented as evidence. Harlan Greer, who was in the room, looked at her with the cold fury of a man who has been very comfortable for a long time and is now facing the end of that comfort. And she looked back at him with the steady calm of a woman who has had 2 nights to make peace with telling the truth and is no longer afraid of the consequences of it. When it was over, she walked out of the courthouse into the cold Wichita afternoon and stood for a moment on the steps while the cold moved through her coat like an opinion. Tobias came out behind her and stood beside her. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Like I put something down that I have been carrying for a long time," she said. He offered her his arm for the walk back to the hotel, and she took it, and neither of them mentioned it or made it significant, which made it more significant than if they had. Greer was indicted 3 months later. The trial took another 4 months after that, which meant the late spring of 1879. He was convicted on 7 counts of fraudulent land transactions and sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. Several of the families who had lost their land, though not all, and not the Webbers from Ohio, which remained a particular sadness, received compensation from the liquidation of his assets. Cleet Ryerson was arrested in Dodge City the following February, on different charges but no less deserved, and Dutch Morrow disappeared into the Western Territories and was not heard from again, which was the kind of resolution that was not entirely satisfying, but was the kind the real world offered. By the time the Greer trial concluded, Susanna had been in Caldwell for 9 months. She had a regular income, a room she had made into a place that felt genuinely like hers morning glories planted in a box outside the east window, the first ones appearing in April like small kept promises, and a life she had built out of the rubble of the old one with more care and pleasure than she had expected. She had also, without quite declaring it, become essential to Tobias Hayes in a way that was visible to everyone in Caldwell, and had not yet been verbally acknowledged between them because they were both. She with her history of a marriage that had been a form of quiet loneliness, he with his history of a careful self-sufficiency built over years of living alone, moving toward the thing with the caution of people who want to get it right. June came, and with it weather that was too warm to sit indoors. Caldwell had a small park of sorts, a stretch of grass behind the church that the community had more or less agreed to treat as a public space, where people sometimes sat on Sunday afternoons when the day allowed it. Tobias had asked her to walk with him there one Sunday, and they had been doing it most Sundays since, a circuit of the grass, and then sitting on the bench that someone had built against the fence, under a cottonwood that dropped its white fluff in early summer like a gentle, perpetual snow. It was there, on a Sunday in July of 1879, with the cottonwood doing its thing and the late afternoon light sitting warm on the grass and Caldwell quiet in the muted way of a Sunday, that Tobias Hayes said her name in a way that was different from the other ways he said it. She looked at him. He was turned toward her slightly on the bench, his hat in his hands, and she realized that the controlled, deliberate quality that characterized everything about him, the careful placement, the steady efficiency, the professional composure was entirely absent. He looked simply like a man who was about to say something important and was aware of both the importance and the risk. "I want to ask you something," he said, "but first I want to say something." "All right," she said. "I know that you came here not by choice and that staying was practical at first. That finding work here was the reasonable thing. I know that." He turned his hat in his hands. "But I also know that somewhere in the last 9 months what I feel about you has become the largest fact in my life, and I am not very good at this kind of speaking. But I would rather do it badly than not do it at all." She did not say anything. She was looking at him and her chest felt very full. "I love you," he said, with the same directness he brought to everything, the same willingness to say the thing plainly and let it be what it was. "I want to marry you if you will have me. I want to be the person you tell things to. I want morning glories outside a window and the kind of quiet that is full of something rather than empty. I just want you. Susanna." She looked at this man, who had locked her in a cell for her own safety, and sat outside it all night without being asked, who had listened to her without needing her to be anything other than honest, who had laughed at her spreading her arms in a wagon on the open plains, because he understood exactly what she meant by it, and felt something that was not quite surprise and not quite certainty, but was the particular sensation of recognizing something true. "You said you are not very good at this kind of speaking," she said. "I know. Tobias, you just said the most beautiful thing anyone has ever said to me." He looked at her with an expression that was, for a moment, completely open, all the careful composure gone, just this man, 31 years old, under a cottonwood in Kansas, hoping. "Then yes," she said, "to all of it, yes." They were married in September of 1879. The ceremony was performed by the circuit pastor who came through Caldwell 4 times a year and was delighted by the occasion, as he was a romantic at heart, and had suspected this particular outcome for some time based on observational evidence. Mrs. Calloway made a cake of such elaborate ambition that it required structural consultations. Billy, acting as best man with touching seriousness, managed not to lose the ring. Marshal Delaney sent a letter, which arrived 2 days after the ceremony but was warmly received. The house Tobias had been living in a solid, 4-room structure 2 streets back from the main road, which he had always kept with the disciplined efficiency of a man who was organized but not particularly invested in comfort, became, with Susanna's careful attention, something different. The front room acquired curtains and a rug. The kitchen acquired herbs that she actually had occasion to use. The east-facing bedroom window acquired a morning glory box. Life in Caldwell was rarely boring. There were disputes about cattle and water rights, the occasional altercation that required Tobias's professional attention, the ongoing and complicated negotiations of a town that was simultaneously a cattle trading post, a farming community, and a transit point for anyone moving through the territory. Susanna continued her bookkeeping work, which had expanded considerably, and had recently begun helping 2 settlers' wives, recent arrivals from Germany, with almost no English, learn enough of the language to conduct business without being taken advantage of. She was good at it. It turned out that her father's school teaching had settled in her in ways she had not known were there, and that she had a patience for explaining things and a pleasure in the moment when understanding arrived that made teaching not a sacrifice but a satisfaction. In the spring of 1880, Susanna told Tobias over breakfast. They were eating biscuits, which he had made, and they were good as they always were, because the 2 things he could cook well he cooked with consistency, that she was pregnant. He put down his coffee cup. He looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, which was saying something because she had by that point catalogued his expressions with considerable thoroughness. It was a look of such uncomplicated joy, so purely and immediately felt, that it made her eyes fill. He stood up and came around the table and held her face in his hands and then held her against him, and for a long time they just stood in the kitchen with the morning coming through the window and the biscuits getting cold. Their son was born in November of 1880. They named him Daniel, after Susanna's father. He arrived in the world with a healthy indignation about the whole enterprise and a head of dark hair that was clearly his mother's, but when he opened his eyes after the first day, they were the same steady dark brown as his father's, a fact that Tobias noted with a quiet pride that he tried to keep from being excessive and entirely failed at. Daniel was, from the beginning, a person. Susanna found this remarkable and also exhausting, and also the most singularly interesting thing that had ever happened to her. Tobias, who had privately been somewhat uncertain about the particular practical requirements of an infant, proved to have a talent for it that surprised him more than anyone. He had the quality of steadiness that small children respond to, and Daniel took to him with a preference that was flattering and slightly inconvenient at 2 in the morning. Caldwell in the early 1880s was changing. The cattle drives that had defined it were already beginning to wind down as the railroads moved further west, and the range was increasingly fenced. The town was settling into something more permanent, more domestic, more families, more schools, more of the infrastructure of a community that expected to persist rather than simply transit. Billy, who had turned 20 and had spent 3 years as a more than adequate deputy, married the schoolteacher who had arrived from Illinois in 1881, a forthright young woman named Clara who had opinions about everything, and who Susanna liked immediately and thoroughly. Tom Wheeler retired to a small claim east of town and sent occasional messages that invariably concluded with a complaint about the weather and a note that he was fine. In 1882, on a warm Tuesday in May, Susanna was in the garden. She had gradually expanded from the small morning glory box to a real garden, one that ran along the side of the house and included tomatoes and herbs and a climbing rose that she had gotten from Mrs. Calloway, who had gotten it from someone in from Missouri, which meant it was probably a descendant of something that had come west in a wagon and persisted through sheer determination. Daniel, now a year and a half, sat in the dust at the edge of the garden and applied himself to a project involving a stick and a cup of soil that was absorbing all of his considerable attention. Tobias came through the gate at the back, still in his work clothes but with his jacket over his arm and his hat off, which was his version of being home. He kissed her at the base of her neck, which made her look up from the tomato plant she was tying, and then crouched down to Daniel's level and held out his arms, and Daniel dropped the stick and the cup without hesitation and went into them. "Good day?" Susanna asked. "Unremarkable," he said, which in the general context of a sheriff's work was excellent news. He stood with Daniel on his hip and came to stand beside her. "You have a letter," he said, pulling it from his jacket pocket. "From Wichita, looks like the court." She wiped her hands on her apron and took it. It was from the clerk of the Federal Circuit Court, informing her that Harlan Greer had been denied his appeal and would serve out his full sentence. She stood in the garden with the letter in her hands and felt the last of it, the last living thread of that other life, the afraid and hunted one, the one that had begun in the shell of an unknown marriage and ended in a Kansas jail cell with a steady man sitting outside the bars settle and come to rest. "He lost the appeal," she said. Tobias looked at her. "Good," he said simply. She folded the letter. She looked at her husband with Daniel on his hip and the late afternoon light on the garden and the morning glories climbing the fence, the morning glories that had followed her here, from a box outside a window in a boarding house, then to the window of this house, then into the garden, growing a little further every year the way things do when they are properly tended and not moved around too much. "I think I might like to teach," she said. "Formally. The town is talking about a proper school. I think I might ask about it." "I think you would be extraordinary at it," he said, without hesitation. She looked at him. "You say things like that," she said, "as though it does not occur to you not to." "Why would I not say it when it is true?" She had no answer for that. She had stopped expecting one. In 1883, a proper schoolhouse was built on the north end of town, one room, solid, with good windows on the south side to let in the winter light. Susanna Thatcher Hayes was hired as its first teacher, a position she accepted with a composure that did not at all represent what she felt, which was a joy so genuine and specific that she stood in the empty room the day before the school opened and held her hands together and was simply grateful for a long, quiet moment. She taught 31 children that first year, ranging in age from 6 to 13, in all the necessary subjects. She also taught informal evening sessions twice a week for adults, particularly the settler families, the new arrivals, the people who had come from elsewhere and needed language and numbers to navigate the practical realities of frontier life. Several of her students from those early years would later say that Susanna Hayes had given them the tools to make something real out of what would otherwise have remained potential. Their second child came in early 1884, a daughter this time, named Rose, which was Susanna's mother's name, and which suited her from the first moment, as she arrived not with indignation like her brother but with a quiet, observational quality, as though she had come prepared to study the situation and form conclusions. Daniel was 3 by then, a boy of strong opinions and consistent energy, who followed his father around town with a seriousness that amused the entire population of Caldwell, and who had strong feelings about breakfast food. He had his mother's dark hair and his father's stubborn streak, and was the kind of child who made people smile involuntarily, not because he was performing, but because he was so entirely himself. Tobias Hayes continued as sheriff of Sumner County, which by 1884 was a different job than it had been in 1878, less about gunfire and more about the complicated disputes of a settling community, land boundaries and water rights and contracts, and the occasional violence that persisted wherever people were in close proximity and had things they valued. He was good at it. He was patient and fair and known to be both, which meant that most disputes came to him before they became something worse, because people trusted that he would hear both sides and make something just of the information. He was, Susanna sometimes thought, watching him from across a room or a street, the most consistently good person she had ever known. Not perfect. He had a stubbornness on certain points that she had mapped completely and worked around with the affectionate pragmatism of long marriage, and he occasionally brought his professional gravity home with him in a way that required a specific kind of conversation to unlock. But good, in the deep and particular way of someone who had looked at the world clearly, seen its injustices for what they were, and decided that the small area of it he was responsible for was going to be run as rightly as he could manage. She had told him once, on a winter evening with both children asleep and the stove going and the kind of quiet she now knew was full of something rather than empty, that she was grateful she had ridden into Caldwell that day in 1878, that she was grateful for the two men following her and the wire that was down and the cell with the iron bars. He had looked at her over his coffee cup. "I am grateful for all of it," he said, "although I could have done without the part where Mara was at the back window." "Only that part?" "Well," he said, and the suggestion of a smile appeared that she knew was the full version in his language, "the part where you told me about spreading your arms in the wagon. I could have done without waiting 9 months to tell you what I thought of that." She looked at him. "What did you think of it?" "That you were someone who felt things at full size," he said. "That the world was lucky you were in it." She put her coffee cup down and crossed the room and sat beside him on the small settee that was slightly too narrow for 2 adults and was therefore used by them exclusively, because there was a practical pleasure in the closeness. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and the stove ticked, and somewhere outside the Kansas wind moved through the dark, and the cottonwood dropped whatever it dropped in winter, and the house was warm and full of the specific warm weight of a life that had been built rather than simply happened to. By 1886, Caldwell was a town with a real school, a real church, 2 general stores, a telegraph office, a doctor, and a growing number of families who had come to stay rather than pass through. The cattle drives that had once defined it were mostly memory, replaced by the less dramatic but more durable business of farming communities, small ranches, and the kind of ordinary commerce that required keeping good accounts. Mrs. Calloway, who had been 60 when Susanna arrived, was now 68 and had no intention of slowing down. She had taken on a boarder named Mr. Price, who was a retired schoolteacher from Philadelphia, and who had unexpectedly become something between a friend and a sparring partner, as he had opinions about literature that Mrs. Calloway found stimulating and sometimes incorrect. Daniel Hayes, at 6, was in his mother's school, which had the distinction of being both the best and the most slightly awkward arrangement for everyone involved, because he was bright and interested and also very aware of the specific dynamics of being the teacher's son, which he navigated with a diplomacy that was frankly impressive for his age. Rose, at 2, was learning words with a deliberate, selecting quality that suggested she was carefully choosing which ones she was prepared to commit to, which Tobias said was entirely her mother's approach to things and Susanna said was absolutely not, and then thought about it and said maybe a little. There was a morning in late August of 1886, not remarkable in any external way, not a birthday or an anniversary or a day that had been made significant by anything other than itself, when Susanna stood at the kitchen window with her first cup of coffee and looked out at the garden. The morning glories were in full late summer intensity, a blue so vivid it seemed to be slightly lit from within, climbing the fence and spilling along it, opening their 100 small faces to the morning light. She heard Tobias in the next room, the familiar sounds of him moving around, the everyday domestic sounds that she had catalogued without meaning to over years and that were now as familiar as her own heartbeat. She heard Daniel's voice raised in what was either a question or an argument, hard to say with him. She heard Rose's voice in response, small and precisely inflected. Tobias appeared in the kitchen doorway, carrying Rose on one arm, and stopped when he saw her standing at the window. He looked at her for a moment, that look she knew, the one that lasted a fraction of a second longer than casual, the one that had first appeared in a jail cell on a night when there was every reason to be afraid and somehow was not. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she said. He came and stood beside her and looked out at the garden, and Rose turned in his arms to look too, with the absorbed attention of a small person encountering morning glories for the first time and finding them worth considering. "Mama," Rose said, pointing at the flowers with the authoritative confidence of the recently verbal. "Yes," Susanna said. "Morning glories." "Morning," Rose said, trying it out. "Morning," Susanna said. "Morning," Rose said, with perfect satisfaction in whatever version she had decided on. Tobias looked at Susanna over their daughter's head, and she looked back at him, and between them was everything that did not need to be said: the distance traveled, the fear survived, the life built on the far side of it, the morning that kept coming each day like something newly decided. The years had moved the way good years do, not slowly, not so fast that you missed them, but with the steady, satisfying pace of a life that was being lived rather than merely endured. There had been hard seasons and easy ones, the ordinary griefs of frontier life and the ordinary joys of it, and through all of it the particular solidity of having a person beside you who saw you at full size and did not ask you to be smaller. Susanna Thatcher Hayes, teacher, bookkeeper, former fugitive from fraudulent land schemes, current morning glory cultivator and keeper of accounts for half of Caldwell's commercial district, looked at the flowers opening in the August morning and felt the gratitude she had learned to let herself feel without qualification. She had ridden into a strange town with $3 and a pistol and 2 men on her tail, and she had found an iron bar cell and a steady-handed sheriff, and a life she had not known she was riding toward. The morning glories opened. The day began, and Susanna Hayes stood in her kitchen with her husband and her daughter, and the sound of her son in the next room asking something important about breakfast, and was entirely, completely, and without reservation home.